Hello, I'm Peter Dye, the Academic Manager of the International Study Center at Oglethorpe University, and today I'll be presenting with Bill Lewis, our Center Director. We will be sharing with you a presentation we gave recently to Oglethorpe's faculty regarding working with international students and their content courses. Our goal today is to introduce a few perspectives to help us better understand our international students, as well as a handful of helpful strategies for communication and teaching. I'll introduce some perspectives on how culture can affect our classes, and a few thoughts on dealing with different accents. Then Bill will walk us through some strategies for dealing with communication difficulties as they arise, and also some possible methods for adapting our teaching to a more diverse group. So, diving right in, let's think about how culture can affect the classroom. What are some of the biggest cultural challenges for incoming international students at your university, or your program, or even in your region of the United States? You've probably experienced this in different ways with different students. Maybe it's why some students are resistant to participating in class discussions or asking questions, or maybe taking advantage of office hours. Maybe it's also why certain students have a hard time working in groups, or why others just can't ever seem to follow certain instructions. Obviously, personality and a range of other factors come into play, but one of these factors to consider is certainly culture. And instead of just describing, I'll share a couple of student perspectives from studies on intercultural communication, learning, and teaching. This Nigerian student describes the challenge of making direct eye contact with older people or people of higher authority, which could certainly be a challenge when talking with a professor. It's the same experience I've had sometimes, struggling to convince students that it's okay to interrupt and ask questions, and it's not rude or offensive, and in fact, it's necessary in most American classrooms. One more example. This student mentions how, contrary to instinct or from their culture, it's actually important to disagree with your professor, and in fact, sometimes encouraged. There are multiple elements involved in our international students' integration into campus life. These three dimensions present various challenges, but you'll notice also bleed into each other significantly. In the International Studies Center, our purpose is to help students with this adjustment academically, linguistically, and culturally through things like academic English support, reading, writing, listening, speaking classes, particularly aspects of pronunciation, which I'll get to a little bit later. Also sponsoring conversation partner programs, encouraging participation in campus clubs and organizations. But with all the training that we'll provide them in the ISC, as they enter your content courses, these will obviously still be considerations for our international students. So, thinking about cultural adjustment and communication, what can we do to help? Obviously, our students are working hard to fill any linguistic gaps and navigate an entirely new cultural terrain. And with a little added perspective, I think we as teachers and faculty can help in the process and promote cultural awareness for all of our students, both international and traditional American students. Thinking about the world from someone else's perspective and simply being willing to interact with them has had a significant effect in improving communication based on a number of different studies. Additionally, attitudes greatly affect how well we communicate with others. So that being said, how can we encourage things like perspective taking, intercultural communication, better attitudes, and interaction in general? So I have a few resources today that I hope will be of some use to you and that you can find helpful in working with these students. The Dutch social psychologist Hofstede is known for his cultural dimensions theory that breaks down countries by 6 cultural dimensions that you can see here: power distance, individualism, masculinity, uncertainty avoidance, long-term orientation, and indulgence. Um, and these have been used a lot for international business, but there's a lot of links to the classroom as well. And thankfully, now there's an online tool where you can type in different countries and see the cultural comparisons between them. And it looks like the picture here, but also contains a pretty extensive written breakdown beneath comparing the countries that you choose. And I find it's a really handy resource that I use regularly just to check out cultural characteristics of countries that I may not be as familiar with, or particularly when I have students from countries and I want some quick information about what their cultural background may be. I'd encourage you to check this out. It's a fun link to play around with and doesn't take a lot of your time. but can serve as a nice reference tool. It's easy to use and can give you a deeper perspective about the cultural aspects of various countries. And applications for our purposes, we'll look at on the next slide. And for time, we'll focus mainly on the one on the left there, power distance, and how that can relate to teaching and learning. So how can we relate these elements to the classroom? Well, thankfully, Hofstede's article from 1986 does exactly that. It analyzes cultural differences in teaching and learning, and serves as a great reference guide to teachers. So we'll look first at this idea of power distance, which can be defined as the extent to which less powerful members of organizations and institutions accept and expect that power is distributed unequally. So what does that look like? Well, a country with a higher degree of this index would indicate that hierarchy is clearly established and executed in society without doubt or reason. A lower degree on this index would signify that people question authority and might be more willing to disagree with those in power. So here we have a breakdown of what that would look like for students and teachers and what each is bringing to the classroom. On the left, we have small power distance societies, and these would be societies probably more similar to the United States. Large power distance societies, this might be exemplified in a country like China. And we're not going to look at all of them, but you can notice here that expectations for teachers and students, who is expected to initiate communication, as well as what's expected in terms of disagreement with the professor. And you'll notice that as teachers, we bring a large set of expectations to the classroom, and students come to the classroom with their own expectations. And the purpose here is not to change the way we teach, but I think with an understanding of what our students are coming to the classroom with can help us better understand when these miscommunications arise, or possibly better adapt our methods to meet students that might be coming from different cultural perspectives. And I would greatly encourage anyone that's interested to read Hofstede's 1986 article that breaks down power distance, like in this chart, but also all of the other dimensions and how they relate to teaching and learning. So it's a wonderful resource for those of us in the classroom. And the final point here in terms of culture is that we have a wonderful opportunity to promote and practice intercultural communication with all of our students. And in our ever globalizing world, especially with the internet, it's unlikely that any of our graduates will never work with someone from a different language background or a different culture. And so with a diverse classroom, all of our students, both our international and our kind of traditional undergraduate American students, can develop skills that will help them upon graduation. So for example, negotiation skills that they can develop through class activities, working back and forth with different people to reach understanding or to complete tasks. Additionally, all students can get an opportunity to broaden their horizons with diverse perspectives on how to tackle different issues. And lastly, intercultural communication can help us understand ourselves better as well as others. Things arise like, why do Americans love to talk about the weather so much? Or why do we shake hands as opposed to bow? Or different ideas of personal space, and why is 6 inches versus a foot versus 2 feet considered the appropriate amount? And these are great questions to ask and to kind of observe about our own actions and cultural understandings that we can see better when compared to others. And I think by thinking about these things, it can really promote interaction, learning, and relationships from diverse cultural backgrounds. So next, setting culture aside for a moment, we'll briefly look at the idea of accents, and particularly unfamiliar accents. I'm not going to get deep into linguistic theory, but I'd just like to introduce a few ideas related to how other people sound, as well as how we sound to other people from my own perspective learning, but also based on research. The goal here is just to promote better communication between all of our students. So we can start when we gave this presentation to our faculty at Oglethorpe, we asked how can accents affect teaching and learning, and gained a lot of different perspectives from experiences of professors in their classes, and I'd encourage you to think of your own in relation to the students that will be entering your class. So here are a few things about accents. First, there's a common myth that some people have accents and others don't, which simply is not true. Years ago, when I was teaching in Spain, a student asked me my name, and I wrote it on the board and said Peter. And she asked why I spelled it that way. And we went back and forth for a minute until I realized she was asking me why I said Peter, but clearly spelled it with a T, but seemed to pronounce that middle letter with d instead of a t. And I realized later that's strictly an American characteristic of changing the kind of T sound to a D in the middle of words. Think of Peter, water, little, that her British teachers did not do. And so that was a kind of a interesting understanding or better understanding of the way I sound to others. And we can probably all identify interesting characteristics to our own speech that others might uh, find interesting or find unique or sometimes find confusing. But my point being that we all have accents. They do make us unique, and in fact, they should be celebrated. Um, and it's okay potentially for those sounds to be different as long as they don't impede understanding. And that's something I'll get into in just a minute. Um, Last point here, there are many different Englishes that can be mutually understood. And the idea here is that take Arnold Schwarzenegger and Antonio Banderas could have a perfectly intelligible conversation in English with no problem understanding each other. And there are many, many, many different Englishes from around the world. So the question arises, well, which one is the right English? And this presents a difficult question. Um, there are many Englishes here, from native speakers to first, second, third, fourth language speakers of English that we'll all likely encounter. And again, the idea of what's the right English largely depends on where you are. So again, the takeaway here is that different doesn't necessarily mean bad. We can observe those differences that a student, obviously from Korea or India or Mississippi, will sound different from one another, but as long as we can communicate, it shouldn't be an issue. Now, miscommunication can arise when it is difficult to understand, and that's where two terms come into play here that I'd like to define: intelligibility and comprehensibility. If speech is intelligible, that means we can understand it, and if speech is comprehensible, um, this pertains to how much effort we have to put into understanding. So in many cases, we can notice that someone speaks differently than we may be familiar with, but it's perfectly intelligible and didn't take us a lot of work to understand it. With some different accents, we might find that it's difficult to understand, or it took so much work to understand it that it would be low in the comprehensibility rating. And this is where International Studies Center comes in and our English language instructors, where we can work with pronunciation and different types of sounds. But it is also worth mentioning with accents that, and pronunciation specifically, that not all sounds in English carry the same importance, the same functional load for meaning. So for example, in Monroe and Derwing's article from 2006, they looked at different sounds, for example, the s and sh sound, which carry a very important amount of meaning. For example, if I said where's Sue versus where's shoe, that could cause some real confusion. Those are two very different ideas being expressed. However, the distinction between sounds like d and th does not carry a high functional load, meaning a high importance for meaning. Did you talk to them versus did you talk to them? I don't think anyone would have any confusion as to what meaning was being expressed there, which is important to note because that th sound does not exist as commonly or at all in many languages like it does in English. So kind of picking our battles and knowing what sounds are more important than others for good communication can help us in some of these accent discussions. As I mentioned in the culture section, one thing that has been shown in many studies to greatly increase communicative effectiveness is just familiarity with the person speaking or the accent being spoken. For the case of example, I was listening to a podcast recently from an Italian history professor, and in the beginning, his Italian accent was so apparent to me, but about 30, 40 minutes in, I stopped noticing it entirely. And I think I use this example to show that I think with more time and more familiarity and a little bit of effort, we can learn to understand people a lot better. And here's one more resource that might help us do this. The Speech Accent Archive, another fun resource that I'd encourage you to check out this link. Um, it contains an archive of thousands of English speakers from around the world recording themselves reading the same paragraph. And this paragraph is meant to contain all of the different sounds of the English language. And you can listen to them speak, and it even highlights certain areas of characteristics of pronunciation for speakers from this region or from this language background. And you can browse it and even hear multiple speakers from each language group that paints a little more of a nuanced picture based on gender or age. Um, and it's a really great resource, I think, because it's used often by ESL teachers and linguists, but also by actors trying to learn accents, engineers training speech recognition machines, speech pathologists. But really, it's geared towards anyone interested in foreign accents and the way different people sound. So this could be a useful tool. For example, if you have a student coming from a country or language background maybe you're not as familiar with, it's fun to pop in here, listen to a few speech samples, and maybe that can kind of start to train our ear to be more familiar, which will definitely improve communication. So, a few last takeaways before I hand things over to Bill. With culture and accents, our international students provide us all with opportunities to practice these intercultural communication skills, which are an asset to everyone in our classroom. Um, Also, um, understanding these accents certainly can require some effort and some time, but I think it would be a great benefit to all of our students to be able to graduate from our universities and have practice talking with people from around the world. And I'm talking about for our international students as well as our kind of traditional domestic students. Next, as teachers, I think we can be role models of communication for all of our students. If our students notice us getting frustrated talking to a certain students, they'll pick up on that. But similarly, if they notice us exhibiting patience and promoting this intercultural dialogue and trying different strategies for communication, I think they'll pick up and mimic that as well. Familiarity with different people from around the world, different cultures and accents, can enrich all of our lives and really promote a more dynamic educational experience. And lastly, for our international students, we mentioned there's a lot of adjustment they have to go through culturally, academically, linguistically. And this adjustment is faster and more successful if they're able to form relationships. And so I think making a friend on campus, having good mentorship from professors, being involved in different clubs and organizations, this can help really make that process um, uh, much better all around. And I think we have a great opportunity to do this. So, that being said, I'm going to pass things over to Bill now, who will walk you through a few ideas related to strategies for communication, but also some implications for our teaching.
Changing gears and continuing this 10,000-foot view of working with international students, we can now turn to the topic of communication. And our first question in this section is, have you had challenges when communicating with international students in the past? And what, if any, challenges do you anticipate happening as pathway or conditionally admitted students arrive on campus? Before looking at the challenges, it's helpful to discuss some prevention strategies. The first basket of ideas are speaker focused, which is to say there are ways that we can craft our own speech to be as clear and effective as possible. First, it's important to be mindful of our use of idiomatic speech. Phrases like a piece of cake, or a drop in the bucket, or its morbid cousin to kick the bucket, are not taught or acquired systematically. While learners will have picked up some phrases incidentally, they'll also have many blind spots. In the end, we don't want to hide authentic language, but we do need to use it with care, and if idioms are used in class, it's helpful to pause for a quick definition. Second, we don't all share the same cultural references. While international students are often aware of America's largest cities, landmarks, and cultural exports, they may struggle with deeper and more regional references. For example, it's safe to assume references to New York City pizza and the TV show Friends will land as expected, but references to Savannah, Georgia, or Grits, or Donald Glover's excellent TV show Atlanta might miss the mark. No offense here to the great state of Georgia, nor the great city of Atlanta, but I hope the point is clear. Thirdly, many students who have come through English language programs will be able to use intonation to support comprehension, so pausing, repeating, and emphasizing can be helpful. We can think of this as teaching as a performing art, to borrow Seymour Saracen's phrase. Finally, whenever possible, it's good to deliver messages in as many modes as possible. For example, if after a meeting with a student you decide she's going to do A, B, and C, it's often helpful to write a short email saying as much. This can also be a way to reinforce new vocabulary that might have come up, and it helps prevent a misunderstanding from carrying over and becoming a real issue. In terms of strategies, the first point is that the cognitive load for a conversation in a second language is significantly heavier, so allowing extra time to process is helpful. For an example in the classroom, perhaps after asking the whole class a question, you can have students do a think, pair, and share. Not only will this give your international students a little extra time to formulate an answer, but it will also increase the quality of the answers of the class as a whole. To apply this idea to a one-on-one conversation, if the usual back and forth between two native speakers is like professional table tennis, the same interaction with an international student might need to be a little bit more like a leisurely Sunday afternoon game of badminton. Finally, it's good to acknowledge the possibility of a misunderstanding by checking comprehension along the way and summarizing after main points, and then again at the end of the interaction. Turning now to learner speech, there are a few important distinctions to get out of the way. The first such distinction is between errors and mistakes, and it comes from Corder in 1967. An error is a deviation that arises from a lack of knowledge, so errors represent a lack of competence. Mistakes, on the other hand, are when a learner is not performing up to his or her competence. These can linger longer than one would hope, but they do slowly disappear with practice. There's no surefire way to tell between errors and mistakes, but as a simple and relatively clear example, we can think of mistakes as perhaps the failure to mark the past tense in conversation or writing, or the failure to appropriately add a third-person singular s. These are most often mistakes. Errors, on the other hand, if a learner misuses a new discipline-specific term, this is most likely an error, or when a learner experiments with a sentence structure that has 3 or 4 dependent clauses, we might guess that this is an error. The important takeaway here is that mistakes can and are corrected over time, but errors, on the other hand, cannot be self-corrected, because as the expression goes, you don't know what you don't know. Another, and perhaps the key distinction, is between errors that impede or interfere with meaning and those that do not. As a general rule, errors that do not interfere with meaning don't need to be addressed. Most of this micro-level polishing of non-critical errors simply resolves itself over time. Other points, especially those that are recurring, are pointed out in English classes. What it means is that he is not sufficiently stimulated, just to say he is bored. While this is a minor distinction, one could also argue that it has great potential to become embarrassing or perhaps be perceived as rude. An example of a non-impeding error would be the sentence, "She think Dostoevsky's novels are challenging." In this case, although there is an error with verb conjugation, a missing plural s, we understand and might actually even agree with the speaker. The takeaway on this point is that impeding errors are probably worth pointing out, while non-impeding errors can be left alone. Now, challenges will arise, and when they do, the first question is, do I alert or do I not alert? In interest of maintaining the flow of conversation, we might decide to let the error pass. A study from Firth in 1996 found that English as a lingua franca users in Southeast Asia, I believe Hong Kong, Singapore, and Malaysia were the countries studied, were successfully able to let minor issues pass and arrive at the end of the conversation with essentially the same understanding of the interaction. Now, a more relevant study from Lindemann in 2002 found that L1 users often use this as an unsuccessful avoidance strategy. The takeaway here might be, while it might be more comfortable and easier, we do need to be cautious when letting it pass. When we do decide we need to repair, the best strategy is to repeat, and when we repeat, it is essential that we do so using different words. We can try to use synonyms, and we might also paraphrase sections of the utterance. Pronoun reference is something that's notoriously tricky for English language learners, so using proper nouns in the place of pronouns that they represented can often clear up some confusion. It helps us be a little bit more explicit about who did what to whom. While this tip is important for our own speech, it's equally, if not more important for our learners to keep in mind. So you'll likely find yourself needing to make this recommendation to a student who's having a hard time as often as you need to actually use it in your own speech. We might also find ourselves needing to give a clarification request. And at the risk of oversimplifying the research, as learners progress, they tend to prefer less explicit correction. So clarification requests or invitations for the learner to repair his or her speech provide a nice way of allowing the student to self-correct. Additionally, research of English as a lingua franca users has found that patience is a key to working through these issues. Admittedly, patience is an inexhaustible resource, but as a workaround, whenever I've found myself in short supply, I've been able to find a little bit more by imagining what it's like to have something to say in a second language but be unable to articulate it. And certainly a point of debate, but I would argue that the latter is more frustrating. So imagining what it's like to be the student is often a helpful strategy. Finally, we have the TSA-approved louder and slower strategy. I'm sure we've all seen this play out in the baggage claim area at the international terminal. It should come as no surprise that this is usually not effective or helpful. This point actually does show up in the literature, and I'd argue that it does so to highlight the fact that misunderstanding often does hinge on a word or a phrase. So stepping back, trying to reformulate with different words is helpful. That said, there are cases in which we should probably just try it a little bit slower. As you can probably see, there are many factors to consider, and each interaction is unique. In the end, as long as we don't let minor misunderstandings snowball into larger, more significant ones, we do our best to understand students where they are, and we keep in mind that conversation is in fact a two-way street, we'll be on the right track. Switching gears again, we can take this conversation more directly into the classroom, and our next question here is, in discussion or task-based sections of a class, have you found international students to be as active as domestic students? And what strategies do you use when a student is not actively participating in a class activity? There are many variables at play here, so we thought the best approach would simply be to share what is done to ensure or to deal with the question of active participation in the world of English language teaching, and to use this as a comparison for regular undergraduate and graduate instruction. A quick word of caution, some or all of these strategies might actually be familiar. First, very rarely in an English for Academic Purposes or EAP course do instructors just tell students to find a group of 4. Rather, we try to be very intentional in our grouping, either to avoid groups with a shared first language, or to pair stronger students with weaker students, or more talkative with more reticent, or sometimes the talkative with the talkative, and so on. An approach like this could be helpful as you begin to see pathway students in your classes. Also, giving very explicit directions before beginning any group work is key. These directions can address the topics to discuss, the manner in which to discuss them, or even the roles that the group members should be playing. Second, there's an increased chance that the directions relayed orally can be misunderstood, so instructors usually make a quick pass of the room to make sure everyone's on the right track. If it's a whole class discussion, EAP instructors often use direct questions to elicit participation. In my own classes, I try to use these questions as a way to keep students comfortably on the edge of their seat anytime we're all discussing a topic. Next, scaffolding is hugely important. A good argument could be formulated for the fact that EAP programs are essentially a form of scaffolding, which is to say that they build the skills that enable one to succeed in university classes. But this also works on a smaller scale. So breaking down tasks into their sub-skills, vocabulary, and the requisite background knowledge and context can also help diagnose and treat the problem on equal participation. Finally, when all else fails, individual meetings are essential. These are sometimes just informal asides after class, but we also want to remove the stigma of visiting a professor during office hours, because many issues can be resolved wholly or partly with a quick chat in a different setting. For our next question, we turn to writing. And what we're thinking about here is, what do you do when a student submits a writing assignment that is below expectations in terms of content and/or mechanics? Now, at the risk of being overambitious, I'll try to share the second language writing pedagogy in a single slide. Wish me luck. First point here is that writing is a process. I'm sure this is nothing new to anyone. A process is, to one degree or another, how all good writing, whether it's novels, news stories, academic or professional work, or undergraduate history papers, is created. Maybe the only thing worth pointing out here is that by virtue of having more to learn, L2 writers have a greater chance to learn when they put their writing through a process. For some, this process is new, and we teach them how to do that in the Pathway program. And I hope they take it forward and apply it more or less independently in their content courses, because that is certainly the way it is designed. The second point here is that a good process will only get you so far. Students do need explicit knowledge about the features of target texts, and genre-based pedagogy is designed to fill this gap. Often in EAP classes, we start by reading and analyzing samples from the genre, whether it's an email, a restaurant review, a lab report, or an argument. While reading, we look for key organizational, grammatical, and lexical features. Once those have been identified, there may be some controlled practice, and then learners go off to construct their text, which can later be revised several times using many of the keys of a process-based approach. Along the way, corrective feedback is essential. The story of corrective feedback, even for L1 writers, is muddled and not encouraging. To summarize in a single sentence, teachers spend inordinate amounts of time scribbling comments in the margins, and very little of it is actually worked into revised versions of the text. But an article from Ferris in 2003 provides a nice overview, along with a few suggestions that we can actually do something with, rather than just throw our hands up. First, feedback is most effective at the intermediate stages of composing. Essentially, learners need a little time to work out what they think the text should look like before they get feedback, and if the feedback comes too late, which is to say after it's already been graded, they'll only pay attention to the letter at the top of the page. Second, straightforward, directive, and concrete feedback is best. When thinking of feedback for L2 writers in comparison to L1 writers, the key difference might be how directive to be. For good reason, with L1 writers, we often try to be non-directive. We give suggestions and hints. We try to lead them to the answer. This approach is a little harder to apply with L2 writers because they might lack the knowledge to make the individual revisions. There may be something that they actually don't know that we have to help them with. So, as a general rule, slightly more directive feedback is suggested. Third, L2 writers need feedback on all aspects of a text. So content, structure, grammar, mechanics, but they do not and cannot handle feedback on all errors. So it's important to prioritize the errors that do interfere with meaning. And for mistakes, it's good to provide holistic feedback as a helpful check. This might be a reference to verb tense or parts of speech. If an error has been repeated, we can point that out and send the learner back into the text to try to find ways to revise. Next, since the development of a writer is a very unique and individual process, often individual meetings with instructors are a great way to deal with issues in writing. So for example, while it might be easier to pass a draft back and forth via email, we might be able to save time by having the student come to visit our office and discuss some of the changes for 20 or so minutes. As a final point, campus resources are hugely important. And we really do want to push students to take full advantage of these resources. That could be in the form of tutoring or academic support, the Writing Center. At Oglethorpe, there's the International Study Center. On other campuses, the English Language Program might be a place to go. It often takes a little bit of effort to get students to use these resources the first time, but I've known very few students who have taken full advantage of the resources and not, in the end, gone on to be successful. So we try to do whatever we can on that front. So, overly simplified, writing in a single slide, but hopefully there's a few points there that we can think about and compare to how we teach writing in disciplines or teach writing to traditional undergraduate students. And with that, we can turn to our final question, which might be sitting on top of all these questions, and that is teaching international students different than teaching domestic students? And for this, we'll turn to Dr. Scott Stevens, the director of the English Language Institute at the University of Delaware, who is quoted as saying, "Good pedagogy for international students is just good pedagogy."
Hello, I'm Peter Dye, the Academic Manager of the International Studies Center at Oglethorpe University, and today I'll be presenting with Bill Lewis, our Center Director,